She pushed open the back door carefully, trying to escape the suffocating heat of the kitchen. Outside, the sun was melting the asphalt, and across the street, an elderly man with a tired look and a weather-beaten face stood motionless with his service dog panting at his side. His faded military cap said more than any words. Without thinking, Clara crossed the sidewalk, crouched down, and offered a bowl of fresh water to the animal and a cold bottle to the veteran. He didn't say anything, but his eyes lit up for a second. What Clara didn't realize was that 2 cameras were recording everything, and someone on the other side of the screen saw no compassion there. Only insubordination. What happened next, no one in that cafe would ever forget. The sound of the door closing behind her was muffled by the heat of the day, but not by the cold eyes watching her from a hidden room. The manager said nothing at that moment. He just turned up the volume on the camera, zoomed in on her face, and nodded as if he had already made up his mind. Clara went back to work with a light heart, never imagining that such kindness would come at such a high cost. Later, as she wiped the tables with the damp cloth and her calloused hands, she heard her name being called on the internal microphone. She went upstairs with a queasy stomach and found the manager with the dismissal sheet already printed. "I don't need people who give up everything for a dog." She tried to explain, but her words were swallowed up by eyes that only knew how to calculate losses. Fired. No right to anything else. Her colleagues didn't say a word. They just avoided looking. As she walked to the door, tears burning her eyes and her shoulders feeling heavy as lead, she took one last look at the camera in the corner of the room. There, in that cold silence, Clara learned that even kindness can be punished. If you've ever seen or experienced something like this, a gesture of empathy turned into a reason for judgment, share it with me in the comments. Sometimes all we need is to know that we're not alone. And if this kind of story touches your heart, leave a like. This helps keep this mission of telling stories that really matter alive. And if you want to walk with us, subscribe to the channel. Your presence here makes all the difference. But what Clara didn't know yet is that that loss was about to turn into something that none of them could have imagined. Clara stood still for a moment, the crumpled paper in her hands trembling slightly. The air conditioning in the room seemed to mock her with its artificial cold, while the heat of shame burned inside her. The manager didn't even look up. He simply indicated the door with a dry gesture, as if discarding something unimportant. She swallowed hard, forcing her legs to move, even though her body begged her to get out of there. When she descended the 3 steps that separated the room from the main hall, she had the feeling that all eyes were fixed on her. Not out of compassion, but out of relief. Relief that it hadn't been them. The dishcloth she was still holding slipped from her hand and fell to the dirty floor. No one bent down to help her. Clara bent down, picked up the cloth, and placed it on the counter, with the same care as someone who is quietly ending a cycle. At the door, she glanced at her colleagues. One of them was pretending to write on the order pad. Another was laughing with a customer. None of them had the courage to look at her. Only a new waiter, with a frightened expression, made a move, but stopped in the middle, frozen by the fear of following the same fate. She pushed the door open, and with the sound of the bell, everything seemed to go back to normal inside the cafe. But inside her, nothing was normal. She walked along the sidewalk with dragging steps. The sun was still burning, but now it was the least of the inconveniences. Humiliation throbbed in every inch of her skin. Her eyes filled with tears blurred her vision, and she didn't even notice when she tripped on the cracked sidewalk. She sat on the curb, as if she didn't know where to go or what to think. She thought about the rent that was overdue, the nearly empty refrigerator, her younger brother, only 10 years old, waiting for her with his torn notebook and the same old question. Everything's going to be okay, right? She thought about everything she still had to face that week, and now, without a job, without strength, and without ground to stand on, her mind was spinning as if everything was falling apart at the same time. And it was. Meanwhile, inside the cafe, the manager was still watching the camera footage for the 3rd time. He paused, zoomed in on Clara's face as she handed the dog water, and then let out a mocking laugh. To him, that gesture was a waste of time, a breach of protocol, a reason for a warning. He didn't understand what didn't fit in the numbers on the cash register. He didn't know the truth hidden behind that panting dog. He didn't recognize the symbol embroidered on the man's faded cap. He only saw weakness where, in fact, there was history, courage, honor. That same afternoon, Clara went to a nearby square. She sat on a worn wooden bench and let her head fall into her hands. No one noticed. People hurried past, talking on their cell phones, laughing loudly. The world went on, indifferent to the silent collapse she was experiencing. And there was no one to ask if she was okay. No hand was extended, no chance to breathe. But there was someone watching, not an acquaintance, not a colleague. The same man from the sidewalk, with his dog at his side, was crossing the street with slow steps. He didn't say a word. He just stopped a few meters away from her and let the dog come closer, sitting down next to Clara, as if he knew. As if to say, "I saw. I understood." She looked up, and for a brief moment, saw in them something that none of her former colleagues had the courage to show. Respect, and perhaps gratitude. The man took off his cap, placing it on his chest with a slight bow of his head. It was not a common gesture. It was a silent acknowledgement. Clara, not quite understanding what was happening, returned it with a shy nod. And the man walked away slowly, with the dignity of someone who has already faced wars, and recognizes a new battle when he sees one. That was the first time Clara felt that maybe, just maybe, that small gesture hadn't been in vain. But she still had no idea what that moment had triggered, or the connections that would begin to happen that very night. Write in the comments, "I value those who have empathy." This sentence alone shows that you believe in the power of those who act with their heart, even when the world doesn't understand. In fact, there was something that no one in that cafe imagined, and it was about to be revealed. Clara kept walking, her hands in the pockets of her worn pants, sweat sticking the fabric to her body. The city seemed different at night, rougher, colder, less human. The lit-up storefronts contrasted with the dark corners of the sidewalks, where she avoided looking directly. With each step, she felt the soles of her feet getting thinner, as if everything in her was wearing away at the same time. Her body, her hope, her faith in people. She passed a diner where she had worked 2 years ago. The old manager recognized her at a glance, but didn't wave, not even a smile. Clara kept walking without stopping. The feeling of invisibility was heavier than her hunger. She sat down on a stone bench in front of a closed laundromat. The smell of soap in the air reminded her of her mother, who always said, "No matter how dirty everything is, you can always start over." But it had been a long time since Clara had seen a new beginning. The rent was already 8 days overdue. The electricity bill would come with a notice that the power would be cut off, and her younger brother Gabriel, 10 years old and with the sweetest eyes in the world, would ask again, "Will you pick me up from school tomorrow?" She didn't have the courage to answer. Meanwhile, in a small house a few kilometers away, the veteran turned on a dim light on the wooden table. The dog, already fed and lying next to him, raised his head with a short bark. The old man sat down, opened an iron box with the emblem of the armed forces, and took out a set of medals. He touched one of them as if it were fragile. An engraved name. A distant country. A memory of dust, blood, and voices that no longer exist. But what kept him there the most was not the war. It was the silence of the aftermath. The emptiness of returning home and realizing that no one cared. That's when he picked up the phone and dialed. 3 numbers. Just 3. A contact he almost never used. "It's Commander Lewis. I need you to prepare a visit," he said, his voice firm, without beating around the bush. On the other side, only silence. Then a short answer. "Understood, sir." And at that exact moment, something began to move. Slowly, but with military precision. Clara didn't know it, but her gesture had activated a dormant memory in someone who had already lost almost everything. The kind of memory that is never forgotten. The kind of debt that a veteran carries like an invisible burden. The one of never leaving a companion behind. Even when that companion is a cafe attendant with kind eyes and sweaty hands. The next day, she woke up early. Not because she had anything to do, but because she couldn't sleep anymore. The old mattress on the floor could barely hold the weight of her thoughts. She put on the same clothes, the only clean ones, and went out to try to find something. She went from store to store, facing doors and looks that always ended in the same way. "We're full at the moment, sorry." The last refusal hurt more than the others. The girl at the counter smiled and said, "You seem like a good person, but we don't have any openings for people who have already been let go from other places, you know." Clara shook her head. She understood. She understood too much. Across town, preparations had begun. 3 trucks bearing the local base's crest were lined up. The Marines received the order without explanation, but anyone who had served under Lewis knew, when he gave a personal order, it was for something beyond protocol. It was a matter of honor. Uniforms were pressed. Boots shined. Support dogs were trained. One in particular seemed to understand what was coming. It was the same dog Clara had helped, their war buddy, now retired, but still alert. Meanwhile, Café Tannen was operating as usual. The tables were filled with empty voices. The manager, inflated by the silence of his subordinates, was making jokes about employees who think they're heroes. The camera was still there, pointed at the door, and no one knew that in a few hours, that ordinary entrance would be the scene of something that would change everything. Clara, sitting in the square again, watched children playing with kites, mothers distracted by their cell phones, and wondered if all of this would ever make sense. If the world still rewarded those who did the right thing. Or if kindness, as she had been told once, was just another way of being forgotten. But at that very moment, one of the Marines was checking the roster, and the veteran was placing his cap on his head, aligning his badge with ritual care. He wasn't doing it for himself. He was doing it for something bigger. For a girl who dared to offer him water. For someone who saw more than an old man on the sidewalk. For a memory that needed to be restored. Clara wiped her face with her sleeve and stood up. I still didn't know what I would do that afternoon, but something inside her was beginning, deep down, to sense that the story wasn't over yet. Comment there. The truth comes to light. This already shows that you also believe that simple gestures can change destinies. Now pay attention, because what was about to happen in that cafe would silence all the voices that laughed at her. The bell on the door of Café Tannen jingled, but that wasn't what caught everyone's attention at that moment. It was the low sound of the engines turning off, one after the other, like a march finally coming to a halt. The first truck was huge, dull gray, with the base's coat of arms emblazoned on the sides. The 2 behind it looked like exact replicas, as if they had been aligned with a compass. The air in the room froze. A waiter dropped his tray, and the sharp sound of the plate breaking echoed louder than the conversations. Everyone turned. The door swung open, but not with haste, with presence. Dozens of Marines strode in, their boots clicking against the polished floor. No one spoke. No one smiled. The seriousness was almost solid. In front of him, the veteran walked with a slight tremor in his hands, but his gaze was fixed as stone. His old but well-kept uniform bore carefully sewn medals. And to his left, the dog, now wearing a red scarf around his neck, walked as if he knew exactly what was about to happen. The manager, who just seconds before had been laughing out loud at some unfunny joke, fell silent. He swallowed hard, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to say. "Where is the owner of this place?" The veteran's voice was firm, full of purpose. The manager composed himself, ran his hand through his hair and tried to smile. "It's me." "Is there a problem, sir?" The silence that followed was more tense than any scream. The veteran took another step forward, took something out of his pocket, and placed it on the counter. A military badge, old, heavy, with an inscription that no one there could read. But that made one of the younger soldiers swallow hard. 22 years ago, I served alongside men who would give their lives for their comrades. Some of them did. One of them saved this dog. And that dog, sometime later, saved mine. Yesterday, he and I stood outside this cafe, just trying to breathe in peace. We were ignored, except for one young woman. The manager looked away. Some customers were already filming with their cell phones. She offered me water, nothing more. But in that simple gesture, she restored in me a memory that time had almost erased, that there are still good people in this world, and you sent those people away. One of the Marines stepped forward, pulling a small blue box with a gold insignia from his pocket. That's an honor we don't give to civilians. But Commander Lewis made sure to make an exception. Clara, standing outside, watched everything without understanding. She had only come to get her forgotten wallet, but she froze when she saw the trucks. Now her eyes were fixed on the inside of the cafe. And her name was being mentioned. An employee recognized her through the window. He pointed discreetly. The veteran turned. When he saw her, his hardened eyes softened. He walked over to her, took off his cap with a ceremonial gesture, and said in front of everyone, "Clara, yesterday you were fired. Today you will be remembered." She didn't know what to say. She was wearing the same clothes as before, her hair tied up in a mess, and her eyes were still marked by sleepless nights. But there, on that hot sidewalk, surrounded by men who had learned to identify the true value of a gesture, she was the only one who shone. One of the soldiers made room. Clara was led to the center of the cafe, where the small blue box was handed to her. When she opened it, she saw a plaque with her name engraved on it and the words, "Silent courage is the most powerful of weapons." The reaction was immediate. Customers applauded. People came out of the cafe to see her up close. The manager, cornered, tried to justify his decision with vague phrases. But no one listened anymore. No one wanted an explanation anymore. The focus now was on Clara and the dog, who lay down at her feet as if to say, "It's safe here." Outside, the trucks were still waiting, but the real action was inside. In the looks, in the expressions, in the silent transformation of those who saw an injustice being corrected live. Clara was invited to climb onto the platform of one of the vehicles, where she received yet another tribute in front of the civilians who had gathered in the street. One of the female Marines next to her said in a low voice, "Your name will be circulated throughout the base. They need to remember that there are still people like you." Write in the comments, "Justice has a face." This helps to show that you also believe that empathy should never be forgotten. The most curious thing? The video of that moment hadn't even been posted. But Clara's story was about to reach much further than those cafe walls. The crowd expanded like a collective breath held back for too long. People who had previously been rushing past now stopped to look. Cell phones in hand, eyes wide, sighs held back. Clara, still not fully understanding, remained motionless a few meters from the door. The sun was shining overhead, but everything around her seemed suspended. Every sound, every movement was slow, as if time were respecting the moment. She didn't know whether to take a step forward or retreat. Her heart was beating so loudly that it seemed to echo outside her body. The manager, in turn, tried to rescue the posture that had always defined him: superiority. But his arrogance could not withstand the weight of the uniform in front of him. "She wasn't a stable employee, you know," he muttered, in a desperate attempt to defend himself. The veteran didn't even respond. He just continued to look firmly, as if he didn't need to raise his voice to impose justice. Clara finally took a step, then another. And when she got close, the commander, in a deep and yet welcoming voice, said, "Miss, could you come with us?" She nodded curtly, but inside everything in her was screaming. Fear, surprise, relief. It was as if all the feelings she had been holding in for the past few days had exploded at once. The dog, recognizing her immediately, wagged his tail and leaned against her leg. Clara smiled for the first time in a long time. And only then did she realize that she was crying again, but this time for a completely different reason. The small cut on her chin, made days before when she had tripped on the street trying to escape her own pain, was still there. Her skin was marked, her eyes were sunken. But in that moment, Clara was no longer the girl who got fired from the cafe. She was someone who represented something bigger, the symbol of a truth that many people forget. True strength doesn't need a uniform, only character. The Marines led the way, and she was invited to climb into the lead truck. Inside, the air was chilly, but the mood was one of reverence. A makeshift screen was turned on. On it, old footage of military missions, of the dog-saving soldiers, of the veteran being rushed out after an explosion. No narration, just images. Clara watched in silence, her eyes wide and her heart growing smaller at the immensity of the history she had touched with such a simple gesture. At the end, a photo of her holding the bowl of water appeared, captured by the cafe's security camera. One frame, one moment, the proof. The commander turned to those present and said, "What she did cannot be taught. It can only be acknowledged. And that is what we are doing here." Outside, the city already knew. Video circulated on social media. A journalist who was passing by the scene broadcast everything in real time. Comments exploded. "She deserves a medal. This manager should learn what humanity is." Crying as if she were my family. On the sidewalk, the manager hid inside the cafe. He tried to turn off the cameras, cover his tracks, but it was too late. The impact had already spread. People's mindsets were beginning to change. A simple revelation had become a ripple. Empathy is not weakness. It is courage. Clara was taken to the military base that same afternoon. When she arrived, a group of children of soldiers, was waiting for her with handmade signs. One of them read, "Thank you for taking care of our hero." She almost fell to her knees when she saw it. I had no idea that her actions had achieved so much. I had no idea that she was, at that moment, experiencing a transformation that would mark her entire life. In the main hall of the base, she was greeted with applause. Officers, nurses, veterans, all gathered together. Not out of protocol, out of respect. The commander introduced her as the civilian who reminded us all why we fight. And then they gave her a special medal. It wasn't gold. It was silver, simple, with the words, "Service to humanity." She tried to speak, but her voice failed her. She swallowed her tears, and after a few seconds murmured, "I just wanted to help." A short phrase, but in that place, it sounded like a hymn. The applause returned, louder, more lively, and the dog, sitting next to her, barked twice, as if confirming everything. Write it down. This is what being human is. Because deep down, that's what this whole story reminds us of. That there's still time to do things differently. But what Clara didn't know yet was that her journey was far from over. And the next step in this story would bring a revelation she never expected. The corridors of the base seemed too long for Clara's short steps. With each pair of boots that saluted her as she passed, she asked herself, "Why me?" She still wore her wrinkled blouse, worn shoes, and coffee stains that wouldn't come off even with hot water. But no one there seemed to notice that. They saw something else. They saw someone who, even without a uniform, had done something that many don't have the courage to do. Act with their heart, even at the risk of losing everything. Upon entering the room where the main tribute would take place, Clara felt small. Not out of insecurity, but out of reverence. The walls were covered with pictures of missions, men and women who faced the impossible. It was like stepping behind the scenes of history. And in the center of that silent gallery, her image, holding a bowl of water, her knees slightly bent in front of the dog. She recognized the photo. It was taken from the cafe's security camera. The one the manager had used against her. That same image was now framed at the US military base. He sat down when they asked. The screen lit up. Strong images filled the room. The dog entering a combat zone, dragging a wounded comrade by his teeth. Then a helicopter, dust in the air, gunshots in the background. Finally, the image of him licking the veteran's face. Bloody, but alive. Clara held back her tears, but it was no use. One of the nurses handed her a tissue. She put her hands on her face, trying to hold back not only the tears, but also the impact. I couldn't get the contrast out of my mind. The day before, she had been called irresponsible for offering water. Now, he heard the names of the soldiers that dog had saved. Each name, a life. Each life, a story that would have ended, if it weren't for that animal. And, in a way, if it weren't for her, who had enough empathy to realize that even heroes need to drink water. At the end of the performance, Commander Lewis took the stage. He held a simple wooden box with a hand-carved inscription. "There is no protocol for what we are doing today. It is not in the manuals. It is not in the official orders. But there are moments that remind us why we swore to serve. Clara, today you are our living reminder." She was called. She walked slowly to the stage, her legs heavy and her heart racing. When she opened the box, she saw a special brooch, a silver star with the word dignity engraved in the center. "It's not a military medal," he explained. "It's a symbol of what keeps us human even after war." The applause echoed, but it was the look on the veteran's face, there in the front row, that struck her most. He wasn't smiling broadly. It was one of those faces that had seen too much for easy gestures. But his eyes said it all. Pride, relief, reparation. That night, while Clara slept in a makeshift shelter, her cell phone, an old one with a cracked screen, vibrated. It was a video notification. Someone had posted the moment of the ceremony, and it had already been viewed more than 2 million times. In the comments, people from all over the country. Some said they were inspired. Others confessed that they had not believed in anything for a long time, until they saw this. One of them wrote, "She didn't just give the dog water, she gave us hope." Theater. And what began as a spontaneous gesture became a wave of solidarity. Schools wanted Clara to speak to their students. Animal rights organizations wanted to make her an ambassador. And even companies, which would have previously ignored her, now vied for her attention. But in the midst of all this, Clara remained the same. The same one who would come home and put her brother's old sneakers in the washing machine, who would share a simple dinner with him in silence. The same one who would still be startled by the sound of a door slamming, remembering the moment she was humiliated in front of everyone. Only now there was a difference. She knew what she carried inside. You knew that your journey had an impact, that your mindset, made up of small, daily choices, had value. And when she was officially invited to visit the retired service dog wing, she felt like it wasn't just a visit. It was a chance to give back. To continue the mission that began with an unwitnessed gesture. Right there. Gestures change destinies. Because that's how every true transformation begins. And there's more. Because what Clara would discover in the silent corridors of that military wing would reveal a much deeper connection with the past than she could have imagined. The sound of paws in the hallway was different that day. Lighter. Almost happy. Clara walked slowly, holding a clipboard with notes and her heart beating faster than usual. Beside her, the old war dog walked silently, with his nose slightly raised, sniffing the air as if he were recognizing old territory. They were on their way to the quietest wing of the base, the recently renovated space where the dogs who had already given their all, and who, more often than not, were forgotten after their service would live with dignity. The new project had been named Pata Firme, at the suggestion of the soldiers themselves, and Clara would be the one to take care of everything, from feeding to emotional care. Her presence seemed to transform the place. The animals, many of them scarred by combat trauma, responded to her touch with a calmness that no one could explain. It was as if they knew that this girl understood their pain without having to say anything. But on this particular morning, something in the air was different. Sergeant Baker was waiting for her at the door, with an envelope in his hands and an enigmatic look in his eyes. "We found some old records. We thought you should see these." She picked up the envelope carefully, her fingers already sweating before she even opened it. Inside was a small, weathered file with the complete file of the dog that accompanied her. Official name, Loyal. Classification, Fire Rescue Dog. Missions completed, 17. Lives saved, 4 confirmed. But what took Clara's breath away was the name of Loyal's first handler. There, in faded capital letters, Private Simon V. Turner. Turner. That name carried weight. Clara knew it. Her grandmother had told her stories about it when she was a child. She said that a distant relative had died in combat saving his comrades, but had never been honored as he should have been. The family had dispersed, and no one spoke of it again. But now, that name was there, linked to the dog, linked to her. An unlikely connection, but impossible to ignore. She sat on the floor of the ward, among the dogs. Loyal lay beside her, as if he knew. The cold floor didn't bother her. What bothered her was the idea that maybe that gesture of offering her water, back then, had meant more than she could ever imagine. That night, Clara returned home in silence. Her brother was already asleep. She made some tea, sat on the chair on the porch, and stared at the sky. She couldn't stop thinking. What if she had ignored the man and the dog on that hot day? What if you had kept quiet when you were humiliated? What if it had all been just another injustice forgotten in the middle of the routine? But it wasn't. Because she chose to act. She chose to care. And now she discovered that perhaps she was, without knowing it, restoring dignity to a piece of her own history that no one else had the courage to carry. Days later, during an internal ceremony, Clara was called to the center of the ward. The soldiers had restored an old dog tag that they had found among the dog's belongings. They handed it to her with a silent bow. Turner's name was there, now engraved in bronze, with the words, "No legacy is erased when someone carries it forward." Clara held the sign as if she were holding her heart. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was a different weight, the weight of truth. The weight of the responsibility of continuing something bigger than herself. On the way back to the dorm, he passed by the mirror and saw a different woman. The same Clara, but not the one from the cafe. The one who had been silently dismissed, judged for helping. No. The Clara who looked back at him now knew who she was. He knew the impact of his decisions. You knew that even when everything seems small, there are huge stories waiting for a simple gesture. Write in the comments, legacy is not lost. Because at the end of the day, it is these invisible links that connect yesterday, today, and what is yet to be built. If you've made it this far, it's because this story has also touched something inside you. And perhaps, just like Clara, you also believe that small gestures can have a huge impact, and that empathy still has a place in the world. If these words touched you in any way, leave a comment below with, "I believe in gestures that change everything." So I know you walked with me until the end of this journey. Take the opportunity to like this video. It helps bring more stories like this to those who need to remember that there is still hope, honor, and humanity out there. And if this type of content speaks to what you feel and believe, subscribe to the channel. Here we don't just tell stories, we connect hearts. There's a video here that continues along the same lines. Click and come with me. There are still many beautiful and true things to experience together.